Hello, Assalamu alaikum. Today's lesson will be on Simla Deputation. The word Simla. What is Shimla? Shimla was the summer capital of the British India, and deputation actually means a group of people on a mission. So, Shimla was a place in India, and today it's the capital of North Indian state of Himachal Pradesh. This Shimla is a hill station and it sits at the border of Himachal Pradesh and Punjab and is India's largest and best known hill station. So, this is from where you get the term Shimla. Okay. Now, if we delve a little into the background and try to understand why was this Shimla deputation needed, then we'll see that a prominent change had taken place in the subcontinent politics, and that was that the British were trying now to ease their relationships with the Muslims. And these relationships had earlier been very strained. They were even now ready to give concessions to the Muslims or, to grant favors to the Muslims. And all the thanks and praise was to be for Sir Syed Ahmad Khan because he was involved in improving the ties between the Muslims and the British for a very long time. Okay, and what they did as a result of this improvement of ties was that they partitioned Bengal in 1905. Now, this went in favor of the Muslims and it struck a severe blow to the Hindus because the Hindus were in majority. And the Hindus therefore started a series of strikes and protests. They started off with the Swadeshi movement and they held a lot of demonstrations. Now, the British could not remain silent on it, so there was a British reaction also to the Hindu protests. What they did was, this just to control the situation and to prevent the situation from getting out of proportion, they took steps including, a restriction on newspapers, public meetings, and a lot of arrests also took place. Now, the Muslims, on the other hand, they also had certain fears in their minds. Now, let us look at those fears. They had feared that the Hindu reaction that was, coming after the Bengal was partitioned would result in, the reverting of the partition, meaning the partition would be annulled or the Bengal partition would be cancelled. Okay, and since the Muslims were a minority, they could never ever come up with such a massive Hindu response as the Hindus had come up with. They could never match the kind of protests which the Hindus had unleashed. So they also feared that because of their being in majority and the Indian National Congress proving to be a very powerful organization, their fears skyrocketed that Hindi would one day become the national language and Muslims would be forcefully converted into Hinduism, which was one agenda of the Hindus at that time. Another thing that disturbed their minds or impinged upon the Muslim minds was that a new government had come to power in Great Britain, and this government was the new liberal government. This new liberal government, it was in favor of increasing the local participation in the governance of India, which meant that more Hindus would now be in the local governments. Why? Because Hindus were in majority. If more people in governance, then that would mean the majority would get their participation in the local governments. So therefore, to rectify this situation or to get out of this situation, so the Muslims came up with a demand. And on 8th of October 1906, a small mission which was headed by Sarah Khan, it visited Lord Viceroy, yeah, a Viceroy who was Lord Minto at that time, and he was at Shimla at that time. So they visited him and they put forward certain demands. Now, before we look at the demands, we have to understand the position of the Muslims and what was it that they were asking for. So their demands, they rested on this particular principle. That is, they wanted that the position of the Muslims should not be estimated merely on their numerical strength, okay, but in respect to the political importance of their community and the service it has rendered to the empire. This was what Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had also asked the British to do. That is not to look at Muslims as merely, as the numbers, but to give them respect in accordance with their political importance and the services that the Muslim community was rendering, years for years to the British Empire. Okay, now let us look at the demands. So the two demands, most important demands that the Muslims asked for or put forth were that in the local and in the provincial elections, the Muslims should have separate representatives. And those separate representatives should be elected by Muslim only voters, right? Secondly, in the local bodies or in the local councils, the Muslims should be given a high percentage of seats than their percentage population. Now, to understand this, look at this diagram. Supposing this is a local body, and the Hindus are in a majority and the Muslims are in a minority. Naturally, the Hindus would have a large number of seats, and the Muslims would have less number of seats or no seats at all. So, this was the demand that the Muslims had made, that the Muslims should be given a higher percentage of seats than their percentage of the population. And secondly, they were also asking that the Muslim representatives should have, reserved seats in the local bodies. Meaning, if you go by the majority rule, then obviously there will be no Muslim seats in the council. Most of the seats would be occupied by the Hindus, and since Indian National Congress was in power, most of the votes would go to the members of the Indian National Congress who were Hindus, and they would be the ones representing or sitting in the local body. However, the Muslims demanded that there should be several seats that should be reserved for the Muslims, so that only Muslim representatives would sit on them, and those Muslim representatives should be elected by the Muslim voters, because obviously Hindu voters would never vote for a Muslim representative. Only a Muslim voter would vote for a Muslim representative. So this was the demand made by the Muslims. What were the two demands? Number one, to give the Muslims a higher percentage of seats in the local bodies than the percentage of the population, and secondly, that in the local and the provincial elections, the Muslims should have separate representatives, and those representatives have to be elected by the Muslim voters only. Now, let us look at the importance of the Shimla Deputation. How important was the Shimla Deputation? It is said that the direct result of the Shimla Deputation was the establishment of a Muslim party by the name of All India Muslim League. How did this happen? Now, when this Shimla deputation had gone to meet the Viceroy of India, who was Lord Minto at that time, it signified that Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's efforts had not gone in vain, they were successful. And this was very evident from the improvement of the Muslim British relationships. And now the British were ready to work together with the Muslims. They even had made concessions for them, and this was reflected in the partitioning of Bengal. And secondly, the Muslim community now felt that they were a separate entity. They should be treated as such, and therefore they needed a secure place in the constitution. So now the Muslim Hindu rivalry, which existed on grounds earlier, now would be seen on paper as well, on the constitution as well. Okay. Thirdly, the Muslims as a community, there was a realization amongst them that they were a separate community and their interests could not be represented by the Indian National Congress or the INC. And therefore, they could not rely on the INC. They needed a new party of their own, and that had to be a Muslim party. And therefore, this resulted in the establishment of an All India Muslim League. So, with this, we conclude. In today's lesson, we discussed Shimla Deputation. What was it? The demands made by the Muslim leaders who had gone to Shimla to meet the viceroy, and what was the importance of this deputation. If you get a question on the importance of this Shimla deputation, you can write these points down. If you get a question on what was the Shimla deputation, you can write the earlier points that we mentioned, a little about the background and the points that the Muslim leaders had put forth. So with this we end. Till my next video, I'm signing off.